안녕하세요, 여러분.
Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat. Welcome to Fully Booked Read Asian Month 2021.
Today, we're going to be sharing to you our experiences translating Korean literature into English.
So first of all, let us introduce ourselves.
I'm Kristina Rico, and I work as a Korean language teacher in the Korean Studies program of Ateneo de Manila University and UP Department of Linguistics.
I teach Korean language in Department of Linguistics, UP Diliman, and I also work for UP Korea Research Center. So let us begin and we will share some points and we can share experiences as we translated Korean literature into English together. So Casey and I will start with the first point, how we really started as a translator. How did you become a translator?
So I think it started when I first learned Korean in 2007. I really fell in love with the language. I never had anything I was passionate about except for Korean language. And
wow.
Yeah, so I decided to continue learning it. And eventually, I also dreamed to become a teacher of the language. I was inspired by the teachers who taught me Korean, including you, Kim. And yeah, when I took my MA in Korea, I started to be more familiar with the culture and the literature of the country. And I think it was in 2015, after finishing my MA studies, that I become interested in doing translation work. But I never really got the chance to do so until this opportunity to translate Kim Soo-hyun's I Decided to Live As Me was proposed.
Yeah. Just like Casey, since I also teach Korean language, there were several cases that I was involved in different kind of translation works, but it was also my officially very first literature translation. Before we tried some other things, but it was quite a turning point for us professionally, that it was given by one of the biggest publisher in the Philippines, and it's also very memorable because we became co-translators for this particular book.
For you, Sonsenim, what is the role of a translator in bridging the gap brought upon by language?
People usually think translator is just transmitting from one language to another language, but it has a deeper meaning. And as I gain more experiences in translating, I really see the importance in showing the right message to the readers. So more than the language itself, it's really connection between two languages or more than two languages and different cultures, how translators can really play a crucial role as a bridge between different cultures and different language speakers.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sonsenim. Translators have an important role to play in terms of connecting people, not just people, but connecting different societies. And that is through literature that we do that. That is through the knowledge of the language, not just of the language, but the knowledge we have of the cultures we deal with. And I think as translators, we allow people to experience different world experiences.
Yeah, I think the key word here is really connection and experience, word experience. Yeah. So maybe I can ask Casey one question. How do you really approach text when you are given translation work? And since it's from Korea, it's Korean literature, so how do you really immerse yourself in the book?
Well, with the case of I Decided to Live As Me, I read it even before we were asked to translate the book. So it was a different experience reading it for the first time, because I was just a normal reader who enjoyed reading the book, who was able to really connect with some of the lines presented in the book. But as a translator, you have another role to play. You have to be able to make sure that you understand the culture behind the words, the sentences written in the source language. So for me to be able to do that, to immerse fully in the book, I just try to read it alone in a space where I can really concentrate, and then I read aloud, like what I told you before.
Yeah.
I have this habit of reading aloud. So I can hear. It's as if I'm really listening to the author speaking to me. So that is how I immerse myself in the book, in the message of the book, and in the voice of the author.
Yeah, I also have some similar practice like Casey. I also read in a quiet place, so I could really focus on the text itself. But since I'm a Korean who's translating Korean text into English, I try to think how this literature was really born in the Korean context, because as some of you have read, I decided to leave as me. It shows how some young Koreans struggle each day. So I imagine, and I also think of the daily life that Koreans are really struggling, so that I could really see the message of the author, and I could really convey what is really being said in the book for the foreign readers.
I have questions on Zini. I just want to know whether the contents mentioned in the book I Decided to Live as Me, whether the anecdotes presented there were also similar to your experience as living in Korea as a young woman before moving to the Philippines.
I think this book was really resonant to let's say those in their 20s or 30s, because that's how really that's what really happens to their daily life. But as you asked me, I could say I also had quite similar experiences, especially the author Kim Soo-hyun was talking in some chapters how she, as a Korean woman, was treated in Korean society, or she felt her, in a certain way. I also felt some similar sentiment, because even like 10 or 20 years ago, some social pressure really existed, and the same social pressure still exists. So I think that really positively triggered foreign readers, that even if they are not Koreans, they could really have some universal sentiment that they could really feel or emphasize in the message of the book.
Yeah, that's true. So I think even if the literature, even if the book was written in Korean, even if the experiences were that of Korean people, it's not very much different from our experiences here in the Philippines. So I think that's one of the reasons why many Asians and Filipinos in particular like this book by Kim Soo-hyun.
So maybe we can share with you some strategies we employed as a translator. Maybe Casey can introduce some.
So the first step we did, even before translating, I Decided to Live as Me, was to do a close reading of the book to be translated. For me personally, I read the book again out loud. I read out loud. I think Sonsanim did that as well. And then we decided on how we want to proceed with the translation and the kind of authorial voice or tone we want to use. So we wanted to make sure that we're using a consistent authorial voice throughout the whole text, throughout the whole book. When it comes to the process of translating the contents themselves, we assigned certain parts to each other. So we, for example, chapters 135 is to be done by Sonsanim, 246 I have to do it. So after finishing our own parts, we send each other our finished translations, and of course wait for each other's feedback, ask for comments, and ask questions if we have things we're not very sure about. I think there were parts that we we had to think of a few days or weeks before we can decide on what and how we would translate those lines to English, especially those that were unique to Korean culture. And in those times that we were having a hard time deciding on what and how to translate certain lines, we would just take a rest, not look at our translation, and just revisit our translation after a few days or even a week. And yeah, interestingly, we come up with interesting ideas and new ways of translating the lines that we had a hard time translating when we did it for the first time. So I think it was a very interesting part of the translation process. And yeah, when we revisit our translation after taking a rest, taking a break for a few days or a week, yeah, we again find some things to edit. So it's a never-ending process of editing, but it's good. It feels good to be able to see for ourselves how we can further improve the first draft that we made. Because we do the translation, we also do the editing, and the editing isn't just a one-time editing. We have to keep on doing it until we're in a way satisfied with our version of the Korean lines. Before doing the final editing, what we did was to read aloud. Again, it's again a loud reading process, to read aloud each line in Korean and in English. So we had to read them again, compare whether the translation is acceptable, whether the message was clearly conveyed. So it was a long process. After loud reading, we do the final editing. We do the final editing and then submit it to our editor. And again, after that, we receive feedback from them. So it's not really a final editing. Final editing comes after. It's really hard to do that. But
it's really hard and it's very time consuming. And I think joint translation has some benefit. Of course, there's some difficulty as well. But I would say translating with a partner has more benefit because, as Casey described, the decision-making process really takes time. But even if it's very exhausting process, we really make sure that we will not miss anything. Of course, we tend to miss things. That's why in the revisiting process, we always go back and we always re-edit or retouch what was unsatisfactory. But those processes keep us going, and we try to, as much as possible, we try to avoid lost in translation. So that's how co-translation works, I think, because some literatures are co-translated and dominant translation is done by one solo translator. So I think our process is should be quite different from one translator doing his or her work. But so far, I think we are also learning, but we also gain our experience so that in the next book or in the next project, we could be more perfectly translate and we could really lessen any loss in translation. What is really a good translation?
For a translation to be considered good, it has to fully convey the message, the main message of the author. And what would make a text a good translation is if the readers of this target language would find it not awkward when they read it. It's as if they're reading a text or a book that is not translated from another language, but was exclusively made for them to read in the target language.
And since the book I decided to leave as me was translated into English, we also took care of the language that could be universal, because even if it was translated and published by a Filipino publisher, we had to consider other English speakers could read this book. Like let's say in other part of Southeast Asia or English speaking countries in other continents. So we try to minimize too much limitation in English that is spoken in just a certain part, but we really try to make it consistently, make it more understood by more readers who speak English. Last year, I decided to leave Esme was first published in the Philippines in English, but if you look into other websites or other places, you can really see so many Korean literatures have been translated into different languages. Especially recently, I think many of you heard the titles like Kim Ji-young, born 1982, and Amon by Son Won-pyong, and Please Look After Mom by Shin Kyung-suk. So these are very famous, very popular English translated Korean literature, especially in the Western Hemisphere. You can also visit LTI. LTI is Literature Translation Institute of Korea. So when you visit LTI website, you can see so many different foreign languages that translated Korean literature, like European languages or Asian languages or any other languages. So it's quite exciting to see the Korean literature titles that are translated in so many parts of different world.
They've been supporting translators
Yeah.
from different parts of the world by offering, I think, scholarships for
And the
foreigners.
workshop.
They have workshops. They also sponsor translation workshops in different countries. So they're really actively promoting Korean literature to the rest of the world, which is inspiring for us Korean language teachers. Of course, we want our students to not just learn Korean, but also learn Korean culture through the literature. Or through literature.
And when we see these phenomena of Korean literature being translated into different languages, we also hope that soon we will also have a lot more Filipinos who can translate Philippine literature into Korean or Korean literature into Filipino language. So we can really have more active cultural interaction in the field of literature. How about you, Casey? What's your memorable Korean literature you have read?
Out of all the Korean literary works I've read when I was in Korea, one of the most memorable ones would be Between Heaven and Earth by Yoon Den-young. It's an old short novel, but it really made me fall in love with the language more. It made me reflect on life and death.
Yeah, you can check out many other Korean literatures these days. So Filipino readers can access English literature first, and then hopefully soon in the future we will have Filipino translated Korean literatures. Some people are surprised that Korean literature is being translated so actively in many parts of the world, including the Philippines now. And people are wondering what's really the reason behind Korean literature is being loved by foreign readers. What do you think, Casey?
Coming from the perspective of a Korean culture fan, I think it's because of course, the influence of Hallyu. It's very important that many people are interested in K-pop and Korean dramas. And I think Korea has successfully moved beyond K-pop and Korean drama towards other forms of Hallyu, like Korean cosmetics, what else? Webtoon, and now we're, of course, moving on to translated Korean literature.
I agree. And since Korea is a small country that was rather unknown to foreigners in the past, but these days gradually being known by more foreigners, I think they also want to experience Korea by reading about Korea. So I think this is another reason that Korean literature is loved by foreign readers, that they want to experience, like even if it's secondhand experience, they want Korea, and someday they go to Korea and then they can really experience and they have this first-hand lived experience in their own life.
Yeah, and there are also a number of Korean movies which
Yeah.
have enjoyed popularity, like The Parasite, Train to Busan. And I think those films really inspired Korean culture enthusiasts to also try to learn Korean culture by reading translated literature of Korean.
Yeah, and this particular book, I decided to leave as me, became extra famous because BTS also read this, and after this book was shown in a small short video clip read by BTS, this book became, I think, sold out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not just in Korea, but in Japan.
Yeah, in
as
Japan,
well.
China, so in so many different countries. So we can really see some positive influence by these celebrities, that they read books, and then some young people also want to follow and they want to read the same book. So Casey, while you were translating these books, what did you love most that about translation?
Okay. So I've been learning Korean for more than 10 years now, and I work as a teacher full-time in one university and part-time in the other university. So I didn't really have enough time to continue studying Korean. It was just more of teaching, but through translation, through doing translation work, I was able to continue learning the language that I'm very passionate about. It was a very beautiful experience to be able to work, to be able to do something that has to do with the language that I really love, so Korean. How about you, Sonsin?
I think learning is one of the things I also cherish when it comes to translation. And another thing I loved about translation was the time I translate, I could really completely focus on the text. So there are so many things going on outside and so many things also going on in my own life. But the time I translate, I really focus, and there's nothing else but there's language and me as a translator, and then the translate text. So that feels like my sanctuary, that I could really see myself as well, reflecting on the text I translate.
Yeah, I think it's a happy stress for us to be able to translate and not be distracted by other things happening in our reality. So we have now a separate world, this world of translating, and it's just a very unique experience. Also, we're very privileged to be able to do this type of work. Many people speak Korean, speak English in the Philippines, but we're just very thankful to have been given this opportunity to work together in translating literary works that are loved by Koreans and by international readers as well. What would you consider, Sonsin, as key lessons that you've learned while doing translation work?
I think translation always teaches me language is so dynamic, because I know both languages, in this case Korean and English, but the more I translate, the deeper I get to see about these two languages. Like Korean is my mother tongue and English is my second language. But to translate and to discover the message of the author and translate into the target language of our readers, the process really teaches me how to more carefully see the language and what's really inside or behind the language. So that's what I cherish, and that's what I really always feel excited about this process of translation.
I would also just like to add how I learned to be more patient while doing this translation work. Working with Sonsin was a very rewarding experience. I think there were times when we could not think of a good way to translate a single line.
Yeah.
When we couldn't think of even just one acceptable way to translate a Korean line. So those days were really stressful. were really stressful, but I think it taught us to be patient with ourselves, because we cannot, even though we know the source language, we are familiar with the culture and that of the target language as well. We need to give ourselves time to immerse more, in the book that we're translating, to reflect more, and allow ourselves to practice doing trial and error, not be too impatient with translating lines that are hard to translate, especially when we're translating a text with its unique culture, with unique experiences, and of course with unique values and ways of thinking. So yeah, I think it's one of the most important lessons that I've learned.
So maybe we can also add a message for those who aspire to be a translator in the future.
Yeah, well, for me, I would say that to those who want to translate Korean to English or Korean to Filipino, one thing that I would want to share with you is that you have to continue learning. You have to continue learning the source language and be genuinely interested in the language you're translating. It's not just because it's cool to do it, but because you really are in love with the language you are working with. I think, yeah, you have to do it to be able to be better at it. There's no other way to be a good translator than to practice it, even without, even if you don't do it officially. If you want to be able to do that in the future or eventually, then you have to keep on working on improving your language skills and your knowledge about the culture you're translating. I think that would be one of the advices I can give to those who would want to translate in the future.
Yeah, I wish aspiring translators can read more, because when you read more and when you understand different styles or different ways of writing from different authors, there are surely things you can learn and you can acquire, and you can make it as your skill. So try to read as much as possible. And for me, translation is not just literature. There are so many different ways we can find translation in our life. Like these days in the Philippines, there are quite a lot of opportunities that you have to translate certain kind of document from English to Korean or Korean to English. And there's also a chance that you have to help government agencies that deal with Korean nationals. So aside from literature translation, you can slowly work on your career as future translator, that you can try a small thing first, and then after some day, I think you can see yourself that you're ready to translate a longer literature or more difficult text someday in your life.
Yeah, I agree with that, Sonsen. There are people who want to do technical translation because literary translation requires more creativity in the part of the translators. It's not enough that you know the source language and the target language, but you have to also be able to creatively write down sentences which would sound beautiful, because you're working with literature here. It's not just a simple sentence. There are many possible ways you can translate one sentence in Korean, and being able to arrange your words beautifully is actually one of the skills that would be required if you're going to do literary translation.
Yeah, so genuinely love reading and writing, and you can really develop your translating skills.
And we're doing that. We're doing that right now.
We are also learning.
So we've been talking about the book I Decided to Live As Me from the beginning of our talk, but we want to also introduce to you some of the other books published by APOP Books. Yeah, so we have this second book of the same author, Kim Soo-hyun. The title in Korean is 애쓰지 않고 편안하게, and this is the English translation, Being Comfortable Without Effort. We also have another book, the third book we translated by Kim Eun-ju, which is entitled 1cm Origin. We have another one to be published, 선생님, right?
Yes.
The title is 가끔은 웅크리고 있어도 괜찮아 by Kim Dan. And the English title is You Can Wind Down from Time to Time. So to those who are interested to read more translated books to English, please check out this website of APOP Books, apopbooks.com, or you can also check our new titles in their Facebook page, facebook.com/apop.
So to wrap up today's book talk, Casey and I will share two favorite phrases from the book Being Comfortable Without Effort, and another one from 1cm Origin. So let me read in Korean, and Casey will read in translated phrase in English. This is from the book Being Comfortable Without Effort, page 55. 관계가 영원하지 않음에 너무 오래 서글퍼하거나 너무 미리 겁낼 필요는 없다. 계절 내내 나무는 모습을 달리하지만 늘 그 나무인 것처럼, 강물은 늘 흐르지만 강은 여전히 강인 것처럼, 누군가는 떠날 것이고 누군가는 올 것이며 당신은 여전히 당신이다.
For relationships are not forever. Don't be downhearted for too long or be so afraid too soon. Just like how a tree remains a tree even if the seasons change, just like how the river stays a river despite its incessant flow, people will come and go and you will still be you. That's for Being Comfortable Without Effort. And for 1cm Origin, Sansini, what would you like to read?
Yes, 1cm Origin. This is from page 148. 미안하다는 말을 대신할 수 있는 것. 길이 막혔다는 말이 미안하다는 말을 대신할 수는 없다. 깜빡 잊어버렸다는 말이 미안하다는 말을 대신할 수는 없다. 회의가 늦어졌다는 말이, 늦잠을 자버렸다는 말이, 복잡한 사정이 있었다는 다른 모든 말들이 미안하다는 말을 대신할 수는 없다. 미안하다는 말은 반드시 대답되어야 하는 말 중 하나다. 그러므로 미안하다는 말을 기다리게 하는 것보다 미안한 일은 없다.
Saying traffic was bad can substitute I'm sorry. Saying I just forgot can substitute I'm sorry. The meeting ended late. I overslept. Something complicated came up, and all other words can substitute for I'm sorry. I'm sorry should definitely be part of the answer. Therefore, there is nothing sorrier than making someone wait for I'm sorry. So we're going to be ending our book talk here. I hope we were able to inspire even just a bit by sharing our experiences translating these Korean literary works. And we hope that you find time to read these translated books, and that you also be more interested in reading Asian literature, specifically, of course, Korean literature and Philippine literature.
Yeah, so Casey and I would genuinely happy translating these titles. So we hope you will feel the same happiness while reading these books. 감사합니다.